Welcome back to History for Hours. Tonight, we drift into the quiet, smoke-filled rooms of Boston, where loyalty is whispered, deals are remembered longer than promises, and danger rarely announces itself. This is the world of Stephen Flemmi, a man defined by patience rather than impulse, where power came from knowing when to speak and when to disappear, and survival depended on standing in two shadows at once. Most people couldn't live a life like this, not because of chaos, but because it demanded living calmly inside constant suspicion. Before we settle in, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. Only if you genuinely enjoy these long, slow journeys through history's darker corners. And if you're listening right now, drop a comment with your location and local time. I love knowing where these stories travel. Now dim the lights, let the hum of the city soften, and settle in as we ease into the cold, calculated story of Stephen Flemmi. The night Stephen Flemmi first understood the power of silence, he was still a boy, lying awake in a narrow Boston bedroom while the city breathed outside his window. Streetlights hummed, radios murmured through thin walls, and somewhere below, men spoke in half-sentences that meant more than full conversations ever could. Boston in those years had a rhythm all its own, measured, guarded, and layered with unspoken rules. Stephen learned early that the loudest people rarely held the most power. It was the quiet ones, the watchers, who shaped the flow of everything around them. He grew up in Roxbury, a place where neighborhoods weren't just streets but ecosystems. Everyone knew who belonged, who didn't, and who needed to be watched carefully. Stephen absorbed this knowledge not from lectures but from observation. His father's presence loomed large in his life, not as a warm guide, but as a figure whose connections stretched wider than Stephen could see. Names were dropped casually, favors were remembered carefully, and loyalty mattered more than explanations. From the start, Stephen learned that trust was currency, and silence was its safest vault. As a young man, Stephen had a natural ability to blend in. He wasn't the type to dominate a room with noise or charm. Instead, he listened. He remembered. He noticed the way people shifted when certain names were mentioned, or how conversations paused when a stranger walked too close. This talent made him useful, and in Boston, usefulness opened doors that ambition alone never could. He found himself drifting toward circles where influence mattered more than appearances, where decisions were made quietly over coffee instead of loudly in public. Stephen's early years were shaped by duality. By day, he moved like any other working-class Bostonian, navigating routines and responsibilities. By night, he was learning a different kind of education, one that revolved around favors, alliances, and careful positioning. He wasn't reckless. He didn't rush. Every step forward was measured, every relationship considered. He understood instinctively that longevity mattered more than speed. People who rushed burned out quickly. People who waited lasted. The city itself seemed to recognize this in him. Boston wasn't kind to those who underestimated it, but it rewarded patience. Stephen watched older men who had survived decades simply by knowing when to speak and when to stay silent. He studied their mistakes as carefully as their successes. Some tried to rule through fear. Others tried to disappear entirely. The ones who endured found a balance, present enough to matter, distant enough to remain protected. Stephen quietly aimed for that middle ground. As his reputation grew, it did so subtly. People didn't talk about Stephen in grand terms. Instead, they said things like, "He's reliable," or "He knows how things work." Those were compliments of the highest order in his world. Reliability meant trust. Understanding meant survival. Stephen never chased attention. It seemed to find him anyway, drawn to his calm presence and measured responses. When problems arose, he didn't escalate them, he dissolved them. Relationships formed slowly but solidly. Stephen understood that loyalty wasn't demanded. It was earned over time through consistency. He remembered favors long after others forgot them. He showed up when it mattered, not for applause, but because showing up built foundations. In return, doors opened. Introductions were made. Networks expanded. Boston, for all its toughness, respected people who understood its rules without needing them spelled out. Yet beneath the surface, Stephen wrestled with questions he rarely voiced. He understood the path he was walking, and he knew it was one that narrowed as it stretched forward. Every connection deepened commitment. Every favor created expectation. But he also knew that turning back wasn't as simple as changing direction. Once people trusted you with their silence, they expected you to honor it forever. Stephen accepted this reality with the same quiet resolve that guided his choices. By the time he reached his 20s, Stephen Flemmi was no longer just observing the game, he was part of it. Not as a flashy figure, but as a steady presence others relied on. His name began to circulate in rooms where decisions carried weight. Still, he kept his demeanor unchanged. Calm, attentive, patient. He understood that power, when worn lightly, lasted longer. As the city moved through seasons of change, economic shifts, social tensions, unseen currents of influence, Stephen remained adaptable. He learned that survival wasn't about resisting change, but about anticipating it. He watched alliances form and dissolve, always keeping himself positioned just close enough to matter, just far enough to stay safe. His instincts sharpened with every passing year, refined by experience and quiet reflection. And so, as Boston settled into another long night, Stephen Flemmi continued to move through its shadows not as someone hiding, but as someone who understood them. His journey had only begun, shaped by silence, patience, and an unwavering understanding of how power truly worked. The boy who once lay awake listening to the city had grown into a man who could read it like a map. One step at a time, always forward, always measured, always watching. Stephen Flemmi's world expanded quietly, the way fog rolls in from the harbor without anyone noticing until it's everywhere. By his late 20s, he had learned that Boston wasn't just a city. It was a collection of memories, grudges, favors, and alliances layered on top of one another. Nothing truly disappeared. It only waited. Stephen understood this better than most, and it shaped how he moved through every situation that came his way. He spent long hours in places where nothing seemed to happen at all. Coffee shops with cracked vinyl booths, social clubs where the television stayed on, mute, parked cars where conversations unfolded slowly, sometimes circling the same point for an hour before landing where they needed to. These moments taught him discipline. Not every silence needed filling. Not every thought needed sharing. The ability to sit comfortably without speaking became one of his greatest strengths. People began to rely on Stephen not because he demanded authority, but because he projected steadiness. When tensions ran high, he didn't add fuel. He absorbed the pressure, listened carefully, and responded with just enough clarity to move things forward. He learned that calm was contagious. When he stayed grounded, others followed his lead without realizing it. Influence, he discovered, didn't always announce itself. Often, it worked best when it felt like common sense. Boston itself seemed to test him. The city was changing. Old neighborhoods shifting, new players emerging, familiar routines breaking apart. Stephen watched all of it with the patience of someone studying weather patterns. He noticed who adapted and who clung too tightly to the past. He saw how pride could undo decades of careful work, and how flexibility could preserve it. These observations became lessons he carried quietly, never spoken aloud but always applied. Trust deepened around him. People shared concerns they wouldn't voice elsewhere. They asked his opinion, sometimes indirectly, sometimes with careful phrasing that left room for interpretation. Stephen answered the same way he lived, measured, thoughtful, and never rushed. He believed that once words left your mouth, they couldn't be taken back. Better to say less and mean it than to say everything and regret it later. At home, life remained grounded in routine. Simple meals, familiar faces, conversations that drifted between the ordinary and the unspoken. Stephen valued these moments more than he let on. They reminded him that beyond the layers of influence and expectation, life still moved forward in small, human ways. These routines kept him centered, offering balance in a world that constantly tested it. As his network widened, Stephen became increasingly aware of the weight of responsibility. Being reliable meant being available. Being trusted meant being careful. Every connection required maintenance, Every promise demanded follow-through. He didn't resent this. Instead, he accepted it as the cost of stability. In his mind, responsibility was not a burden but a structure, something that, when respected, kept everything else from collapsing. There were moments when Stephen questioned how far this path would go. Not in fear, but in curiosity. He understood that every role came with limits, visible or not. He didn't dream of domination or recognition. His ambition was quieter, to remain relevant without becoming exposed, respected without becoming isolated. It was a delicate balance, and he approached it the same way he approached everything else. Slowly, attentively, and with intention. The city continued to hum around him, full of noise and movement, but Stephen moved through it like a steady current beneath the surface. He wasn't chasing anything. He was positioning himself, preparing for changes he could already sense but not yet see. In Boston, foresight was survival, and Stephen Flemmi was learning to see further ahead with every passing day. By the end of this chapter of his life, one truth had settled firmly in his mind. The quiet road was the longest one, and Stephen, patient as ever, was committed to walking it, step by careful step, into whatever awaited next. Stephen Flemmi's reputation continued to grow in ways that felt almost accidental. He never announced his presence, yet people noticed when he wasn't around. In a city that thrived on patterns and predictability, Stephen had become a constant, someone whose reactions could be anticipated because they were rooted in logic rather than emotion. That consistency made others feel safer, more grounded, even when circumstances around them felt uncertain. As time went on, Stephen found himself invited into conversations that carried more weight. These weren't dramatic moments or tense confrontations, but thoughtful discussions about timing, trust, and direction. He listened carefully, always aware that what people chose not to say often mattered more than what they did. He learned to read pauses the way others read sentences, understanding that hesitation often revealed more truth than confidence. The city continued to evolve. Old establishments closed their doors while new ones appeared, trying to claim space in a landscape shaped by history. Stephen paid attention to these shifts, recognizing them as signs of deeper change. He understood that adaptability was essential. Those who refused to evolve found themselves isolated, while those who adjusted thoughtfully remained relevant. Stephen committed himself to learning, observing, and refining his approach rather than clinging to old habits. He also became more aware of the importance of boundaries. Trust, he believed, worked best when it was paired with discretion. Stephen shared only what was necessary, never more. He knew that overexposure created vulnerability, and vulnerability invited complications. By maintaining clear lines between personal and professional, between spoken and unspoken, he preserved a sense of control that others admired without fully understanding. Despite the seriousness of his surroundings, Stephen retained a quiet appreciation for ordinary moments. A shared laugh, a familiar song on the radio, a walk through a neighborhood at dusk. These small experiences grounded him. They reminded him that life was not solely about strategy or positioning, but about presence. These moments provided balance, helping him remain human in a world that often rewarded detachment. Relationships continued to deepen. People trusted Stephen not because he promised outcomes, but because he respected the process. He didn't rush decisions or push agendas. Instead, he allowed conversations to unfold naturally, offering insight only when it added value. This restraint set him apart. In a city full of voices competing to be heard, Stephen's quiet confidence carried its own authority. There were challenges, of course. Misunderstandings arose, alliances shifted, and expectations grew heavier. Stephen met these moments the same way he met everything else, with patience and composure. He believed that reacting impulsively only narrowed options, while thoughtful responses preserved them. Even when situations became complicated, he remained focused on long-term stability rather than short-term wins. Stephen also began to understand the influence of legacy, though he rarely used the word. He noticed how stories were passed down, how reputations were shaped not just by actions but by consistency over time. He wanted his presence to mean reliability, not disruption. This awareness guided his choices, encouraging him to think beyond immediate circumstances and consider how each decision might echo into the future. As nights grew quieter and responsibilities more defined, Stephen felt a subtle shift within himself. He wasn't chasing opportunity anymore, he was managing it. The city still whispered its challenges and temptations, but he had learned to listen without being pulled in every direction. His focus sharpened, his instincts refined by years of observation and restraint. By the end of this phase of his journey, Stephen Flemmi stood firmly in his place, not as a figure seeking attention, but as one who understood the value of steadiness. He had learned that the strongest influence often comes from those who remain calm when others rush, who listen when others speak, and who choose patience over impulse. And as Boston continued its endless rhythm around him, Stephen remained quietly prepared for whatever came next, confident that his measured path would carry him forward. Time had a way of tightening its grip without announcing itself. For Stephen, the days began to blur into one another, not because they were empty, but because they were full in a quiet, relentless way. Every conversation carried weight now, every decision echoed longer than before. He felt it in the pauses between phone calls, in the way people lingered before speaking, in the careful choice of words that replaced casual talk. The world around him hadn't grown louder, it had grown more careful. Stephen adapted by slowing down even further. Where others reacted to tension with urgency, he leaned into stillness. He spent more time observing than acting, letting patterns reveal themselves. He noticed who stayed consistent and who shifted with the wind. Loyalty, he realized, wasn't always loud or dramatic. Sometimes it showed itself in routine, in showing up the same way every day, even when no one was watching. The city at night became a place of reflection for him. Long drives through familiar streets offered a sense of order. Streetlights flicked past like steady markers of time, reminding him that everything moved forward, whether he pushed it or not. In those moments, Stephen thought about the choices that had shaped his path, not with regret, but with clarity. Each decision had carried him here, to a place where awareness mattered more than ambition. Pressure existed, though it rarely announced itself directly. It lived in rumors, in questions that circled without landing, in the subtle feeling of being observed. Stephen didn't panic. He understood that pressure could be useful if handled correctly. It forced discipline. It stripped away excess. It demanded precision. He refined his routines, reduced unnecessary movement, and trusted fewer people with more important information. Despite this tightening world, Stephen made room for connection. He valued conversations that weren't about plans or outcomes but about perspective. Late-night talks over coffee, quiet dinners with familiar faces. These moments reminded him that life was layered. Not everything had to be measured or calculated. Sometimes, simply listening to another person's story was enough to restore balance. He also began to mentor, though he never would have called it that. Younger voices sought his perspective, drawn to his calm more than his history. Stephen offered guidance without preaching. He emphasized patience, awareness, and the importance of thinking several steps ahead. He warned against chasing attention or recognition, explaining that those things faded quickly and often left complications behind. The idea of control changed for him during this period. It was no longer about directing outcomes, but about managing reactions. He accepted that not everything could be shaped or steered, but responses always could be. This realization gave him peace. Even when uncertainty hovered, he knew he could meet it on his own terms. As seasons shifted, Stephen felt a quiet confidence settle in. He wasn't invincible and he didn't pretend to be, but he was prepared. He had built a life around awareness rather than impulse, around consistency rather than chaos. That foundation mattered more now than ever. When he lay down at night, the city's distant sounds humming through the dark, Stephen allowed himself a rare sense of rest. Not because everything was resolved, but because he trusted himself to navigate whatever came next. In a world that rewarded noise and haste, he had chosen calm and clarity, and for now, that choice carried him forward, steady and awake, into the unfolding chapters still ahead. As Stephen Flemmi moved further into his middle years, he began to notice how subtle influence could shape outcomes far more effectively than overt action. He had spent decades learning to listen, to observe, and to place himself where he could see the most while saying the least. Now, the fruits of that patience were becoming visible. People deferred to his judgment not because he demanded it, but because they had learned over time that his advice was measured, considered, and rarely flawed. He spent hours in quiet rooms with others who wielded power differently, often seeing mistakes before they happened. Stephen's strength was not in confrontation, but in anticipation. He could predict tension before it surfaced and diffuse it simply by remaining calm and attentive. Others relied on him to read the undercurrents of conversations, to see opportunities that weren't announced, and to notice risks that were easily overlooked. In a world full of noise, his quiet certainty became a steadying force. At the same time, Stephen grew more selective in the people he allowed into his inner circle. Trust had become precious, and he understood its fragility. Relationships were tested constantly, and the consequences of misplaced trust could ripple outward in ways that were subtle but permanent. He chose companions who valued discretion as much as he did, who understood the power of observation, and who respected the value of long-term stability over short-term gains. Daily life remained grounded in routine, even as influence and responsibility expanded. Stephen found solace in simple rituals: early mornings with the city slowly waking, short walks to clear his mind, and quiet dinners that reinforced the importance of family and close friendship. These moments reminded him that life was more than decisions, plans, and expectations. They were reminders that patience, loyalty, and attentiveness mattered just as much outside of the strategy as within it. Stephen also reflected often on his own growth. He recognized that his quiet presence had become a lesson for others, not because he intentionally taught it, but because consistency is a powerful teacher. People watched how he carried himself, how he responded to stress, and how he prioritized thoughtfulness over impulse. Influence, he realized, could extend beyond spoken advice, could manifest simply through example, showing that measured calm and careful observation are as important as any overt decision. Challenges persisted, of course. Misunderstandings, shifting alliances, and unexpected developments tested his patience repeatedly. Yet Stephen met them with the same principles that had guided him for decades. He understood that reacting impulsively often created more complications than it resolved. By maintaining his composure and responding thoughtfully, he preserved both trust and stability. Over time, Stephen began to understand legacy in a more personal sense. It was not about recognition or notoriety. It was about the people whose lives had been shaped quietly by his decisions, advice, and example. Every interaction, no matter how small, carried potential for lasting impact. By approaching each with care and consideration, he ensured that his influence would endure beyond immediate circumstances. Even in the midst of all these lessons and responsibilities, Stephen remained aware of the delicate balance of life. He appreciated small joys, a familiar song, a quiet conversation, a moment of reflection, understanding that these experiences nurtured the clarity and patience that had become his strengths. Life, he realized, was a combination of observation, thoughtful action, and quiet moments of grounding. As this chapter of his life progressed, Stephen Flemmi continued to navigate his world with measured attention. The city around him continued to evolve, yet he remained a steady presence, quietly shaping outcomes through awareness, patience, and consistency. By understanding the interplay of relationships, timing, and trust, he maintained a position of influence that was neither loud nor ostentatious, but enduring. And so, as the city slept around him each night, Stephen lay awake with a sense of calm assurance. He knew that the lessons he had absorbed, the careful choices he had made, and the quiet influence he wielded would carry him forward into the next phase of life. For Stephen Flemmi, the path of patient observation and thoughtful action was not just a strategy. It was the essence of living wisely in a complex, ever-changing world. Stephen Flemmi had reached a point in his life where reflection became as important as action. Decades of observing, listening, and moving carefully through Boston had taught him a profound truth. Influence was rarely about dominating a situation. It was about understanding it, predicting its shifts, and quietly guiding outcomes without forcing them. He had become an unseen force, a steady current beneath the surface, shaping decisions not with noise but with subtlety. By now, Stephen's reputation for discretion and reliability had grown well beyond what he had imagined in his younger years. People trusted his judgment implicitly, often seeking his counsel in moments where clarity was scarce. Yet he never sought attention for this. He understood that true power was recognized in the absence of showiness. Those who demanded recognition often exposed themselves, while those who moved with quiet precision endured. Life in Boston had changed around him. Neighborhoods that had been familiar since childhood were evolving, some thriving while others struggled to maintain their character. New faces arrived, old faces disappeared, and alliances shifted in ways that weren't always obvious. Stephen had learned to read these subtle currents, recognizing that true insight often came from observing what others failed to notice. He understood that patience was his ally. By waiting, he could see patterns emerge that others missed in their rush to act. In personal life, Stephen remained careful and disciplined. His routines were simple but purposeful. Quiet mornings with reflection, walks through familiar streets that reminded him of continuity, and evenings spent in measured conversation with those closest to him. These routines weren't just comfort. They were the framework that allowed him to remain focused, grounded, and prepared for the unexpected. Even in the midst of responsibilities, he understood the necessity of balance. Stephen's ability to build trust became even more pronounced. He understood that people remembered how they felt in interactions, far more than what was actually said. By offering calm, thoughtful responses, he made others feel understood and supported. In a world where tension and unpredictability were constants, this stability became invaluable. He knew that the strongest influence wasn't aggressive. It was steady, reliable, and reassuring. He also learned to measure risk with extraordinary care. Decades of experience had shown him that even minor missteps could ripple outward in unexpected ways. Stephen's approach was deliberate. Assess, anticipate, and act only when necessary. This method wasn't about avoidance. It was about conserving energy and attention for moments that truly mattered. In doing so, he preserved his position, influence, and personal safety. Observation had become second nature. Stephen noticed small details others overlooked. A change in tone, a hesitation in movement, a glance that hinted at unspoken intentions. These observations guided his decisions more than any plan or strategy ever could. He understood that knowledge without action was wasted, but action without understanding was dangerous. His skill was in knowing when to act, when to wait, and when to remain silent. Stephen also valued discretion above all else. He recognized that sharing too much information or revealing intentions prematurely could undermine influence. Words were powerful, but their impact depended on timing and context. By exercising restraint, he maintained both credibility and authority, allowing others to reveal themselves fully without being manipulated. Even as responsibilities and expectations grew, Stephen made time for reflection. He contemplated the trajectory of his life, the lessons he had learned, and the relationships he had cultivated. He saw that influence wasn't measured by immediate outcomes, but by lasting effects over time. Each decision, each interaction, was a thread in a larger tapestry that stretched across years and decades. By this stage of his life, Stephen Flemmi had become a master of his own domain, not because of force or showmanship, but because of careful observation, measured action, and unwavering patience. He understood the subtleties of human behavior, the nuances of relationships, and the importance of reputation. And in the quiet moments, as Boston streets glimmered under streetlights and the city hummed softly around him, Stephen knew that his path, steady, deliberate, and observant, would carry him forward with the same quiet assurance that had guided him for decades. He was no longer the boy listening from his bedroom window. He had become a man who understood the rhythms of the city, the people around him, and the value of silence. In that understanding, he found not only power, but peace. a measured confidence that allowed him to navigate the world with clarity, foresight, and patience. The journey was far from over, but Stephen Flemmi was ready for whatever came next, prepared as always to move with care, observation, and quiet influence. As Stephen Flemmi moved deeper into middle age, his world had become a carefully constructed balance between influence and discretion. He had long understood that real power was not measured by visibility or notoriety, but by subtle control over the flow of events around him. By now, decades of observation had honed his instincts, allowing him to predict outcomes with a precision that others envied but could never articulate. People sought his counsel not because he demanded it, but because his judgment had proven consistently reliable, and in a world filled with uncertainty, reliability was rare and invaluable. Stephen's presence was like a stabilizing force in Boston. He had become a man others instinctively trusted to handle delicate situations, not because he sought to dominate, but because his calm nature encouraged reflection rather than rash action. Meetings with him were quiet affairs. Words were deliberate, pauses meaningful, and the atmosphere measured. His ability to read tension in a room and anticipate reactions gave him influence without the need for authority, and it was precisely this skill that made him quietly indispensable. Life had taught Stephen that patience was often more valuable than decisiveness. Whereas others rushed to claim recognition or assert control, he waited. He let events unfold, carefully observing how people reacted, noting patterns, and identifying opportunities that only revealed themselves over time. He had learned that haste often led to mistakes, while restraint preserved both safety and influence. This approach, cultivated over decades, had become second nature to him, guiding his every action. In his personal life, Stephen maintained routines that grounded him in the midst of complexity. Simple rituals, a morning walk, a quiet breakfast, evenings spent in conversation with trusted companions, kept him centered. These routines were not only comforting but strategic, allowing him to think clearly and maintain perspective in a life where chaos often lurked just beyond the surface. Even small acts, like noting changes in the neighborhood or observing interactions in a cafe, became part of his ongoing strategy of awareness. Stephen's network of trusted allies had deepened over the years. Loyalty was earned, not demanded, and he had built relationships with people who valued consistency, discretion, and insight. These relationships were not transactional in the traditional sense. They were built on mutual understanding and shared respect. Stephen offered guidance without coercion, advice without pressure, and in return, he cultivated a network of individuals whose influence amplified his own. He also became increasingly aware of the power of perception. People responded not just to actions, but to the energy and demeanor behind them. Stephen had learned to carry himself in a way that inspired confidence without arrogance, that signaled awareness without boasting. His silence often carried more weight than words could, and his calm in the face of uncertainty became a quiet form of authority. Others came to rely on his steadiness as much as his insight. Challenges still arose, of course. Miscommunications, unexpected developments, and shifts in the city's social landscape required constant attention. But Stephen's approach remained consistent. He observed, he analyzed, and he acted only when necessary. His experience had taught him that overreaction or impulsive decisions could have far-reaching consequences. By exercising restraint, he maintained his credibility and ensured that his influence remained intact. Stephen also reflected often on the passage of time. He recognized that influence was cumulative. It wasn't earned overnight but built over years of consistent behavior. Each interaction, no matter how small, contributed to a reputation that could outlast immediate circumstances. This awareness encouraged him to act thoughtfully, to honor commitments, and to maintain the principles that had guided him from the beginning. Even in moments of solitude, Stephen found clarity. The city around him, with its constant hum of activity, reminded him that life was a combination of patience, observation, and quiet decisions. He had learned to appreciate these subtleties, understanding that they were as important as any overt action. Influence, he realized, was as much about what you didn't do as what you did. As this phase of his life progressed, Stephen Flemmi continued to navigate Boston with careful attention. His reputation, built on decades of observation, patience, and discretion, allowed him to move through the city with a sense of quiet authority. He understood the rhythms of human behavior, the weight of trust, and the importance of maintaining balance in both personal and professional spheres. In the quiet moments, when the city's lights reflected on damp streets and distant voices carried softly through the night, Stephen allowed himself to recognize the subtle mastery he had achieved. He was not a man of spectacle or flamboyance, but one of steady influence. He had learned the value of patience, the power of observation, and the strength of silence. And with these tools, he was prepared to continue navigating the complexities of life with the same careful precision that had defined his journey thus far. The road ahead remained uncertain, as it always would, but Stephen Flemmi had long since discovered that quiet patience, thoughtful observation, and deliberate action were more enduring than any fleeting display of power. In this understanding lay his confidence, his strategy, and his enduring presence, a presence that would continue to shape the city and the people around him in ways unseen, yet deeply felt. Stephen Flemmi had reached a point where his life felt like a chessboard, each move carefully considered, each piece positioned with intention. Years of observing the city, the people around him, and the subtle currents of influence had taught him that control wasn't about domination, it was about understanding. Understanding patterns, timing, and human behavior allowed him to shape outcomes without forcing them. He had become a master of subtlety, and in a world that often valued noise over nuance, this skill set him apart. The rhythm of Boston life provided a steady backdrop for his reflections. He would often drive through familiar neighborhoods at dusk, observing the subtle changes that occurred over the years. A new storefront, a shifted demographic, a conversation overheard in a park. All of these details painted a picture of the evolving city, and Stephen had learned to read it like an open book. Each observation informed his decisions, and each decision was guided by foresight, not impulse. By now, Stephen's reputation for discretion and reliability had become almost legendary in his circles. People came to him not for instructions but for clarity, for a measured perspective when circumstances were uncertain. He didn't need to assert authority. His calm demeanor and thoughtful responses spoke volumes. In rooms where tension was high, his quiet presence often diffused conflict before words were even exchanged. He had learned that influence was most powerful when it felt invisible, when people felt they had reached conclusions themselves, guided only by his subtle cues. In his personal life, Stephen continued to prioritize balance. Routine remained a cornerstone of his days. Quiet mornings with reflection, measured meals, and evenings spent in conversation with trusted companions. These rituals weren't just comforting, they were strategic. They allowed him to maintain focus, to process complex situations, and to approach each decision with a clear mind. In a life where unpredictability was constant, routine provided stability. Relationships deepened and matured over time. Trust, once earned, was maintained with care. Stephen knew that loyalty was not guaranteed. It had to be continually nurtured through consistent action and integrity. His inner circle valued his discretion as much as his insight, and in return, he cultivated a network that amplified his influence without requiring overt control. It was a delicate balance, but one he had mastered through years of patient observation. Stephen also became acutely aware of the power of perception. People responded not just to his actions but to the confidence and calmness he projected. Silence, when used deliberately, carried more weight than words. A pause, a measured look, a simple gesture could communicate far more than a lengthy explanation. Stephen understood that perception was as critical as reality. The way others interpreted his presence often shaped outcomes more than his actual decisions. Even as he navigated these complexities, Stephen never lost sight of the small, grounding moments in life. A shared laugh, a quiet evening with a friend, a walk through familiar streets. These instances reminded him that human connection mattered as much as influence or strategy. They provided perspective, ensuring that he remained connected to the world he observed rather than being consumed by it. Challenges continued to arise, of course. Misunderstandings, Shifting alliances and unexpected developments tested his patience repeatedly. But Stephen approached each situation with the same principles that had guided him throughout his life. Observe, analyze, and act thoughtfully. Impulse had no place in his approach. Careful consideration ensured that he maintained both his credibility and his stability. By this stage, Stephen's understanding of legacy had deepened. He recognized that influence was cumulative, built over years of consistent behavior rather than sudden action. Each decision, each interaction, contributed to a reputation that endured. This awareness guided him, reinforcing the importance of patience, discretion, and thoughtful action. As night fell over the city, Stephen often reflected on the journey that had brought him here. He had moved from the restless curiosity of youth to a quiet mastery of observation and influence. The city around him continued its endless hum, yet he navigated it with clarity and calm. Every step was deliberate, every decision measured, every moment an opportunity to apply the lessons he had learned over a lifetime. Stephen Flemmi's life in this chapter was defined by quiet authority. He had learned that true power lies not in visibility or aggression, but in consistency, insight, and the ability to influence without being seen. As the city's lights reflected on the streets and the distant sounds of life carried through the night, Stephen's confidence was rooted in understanding, preparation, and the patient wisdom that comes from decades of careful attention. The journey ahead remained unpredictable, as it always would, but Stephen was undeterred. He had mastered the art of moving through life with quiet influence, and he trusted that the principles that had guided him thus far would continue to serve him. In the intricate dance of people, power, and circumstance, Stephen Flemmi moved with measured steps, ready for whatever the next chapter might bring. Stephen Flemmi had now reached a stage in his life where the weight of experience gave him both patience and perspective. Each day, he moved through Boston with a sense of purpose tempered by observation. The city itself had become a living map, each street and building holding layers of history and interactions he had witnessed. He understood that influence was less about immediate results and more about the accumulation of subtle effects over time. Every word, every gesture, every pause carried potential meaning, and Stephen had long mastered the ability to use those small details to guide outcomes. He spent time reflecting on the relationships he had cultivated over decades. Trust had become the currency of his life, and he valued it above any material possession. Those who had earned his confidence knew it was a rare and deliberate gift, not given lightly. Stephen's loyalty, once established, was unwavering, but he demanded the same consistency from others. In a world where circumstances could shift abruptly, he relied on this network of dependable individuals to navigate challenges, knowing that stability was built one careful decision at a time. The rhythms of daily life reinforced Stephen's methodical approach. Mornings began with quiet contemplation, allowing him to assess the day ahead and anticipate potential developments. Walks through familiar neighborhoods offered him a chance to observe subtle changes and trends, new businesses, shifts in population, or even minor interactions that revealed larger patterns. These observations were not idle. They informed how he interacted with the people around him, helping him choose his words and actions with precision. Stephen's influence had grown to a point where it was almost invisible. Others relied on his judgment without fully understanding why, drawn to the clarity and calm he projected. He had learned that this kind of influence was more powerful than overt control. By allowing others to feel ownership of decisions, he guided outcomes without confrontation. Patience and discretion had become his greatest assets, ensuring that he remained a trusted figure while avoiding unnecessary exposure. Even in moments of solitude, Stephen found purpose. He appreciated small pleasures, a quiet evening, a well-prepared meal, a conversation with a trusted friend, understanding that these grounding experiences were essential to maintaining clarity and perspective. Life had taught him that calm observation was often more valuable than immediate action, and that presence, rather than power, could be the strongest tool in one's arsenal. Stephen also began to reflect more deeply on the concept of legacy. He understood that influence was not measured by notoriety or outward displays of power, but by the lasting effect of thoughtful decisions and consistent behavior. Each choice he made, each interaction he nurtured, contributed to a reputation that extended beyond the immediate moment. This awareness encouraged him to act with even greater deliberation, ensuring that his presence would have enduring impact. Challenges continued to arise, of course. Shifting alliances, miscommunications, and unexpected circumstances tested his patience. Yet Stephen approached each situation with the same methodology that had guided him for decades. Observe carefully, analyze thoroughly, and act deliberately. Impulsive decisions had never served him well, and he had learned that restraint often produced better results than aggression or immediacy. By this stage, Stephen had cultivated a life where influence and discretion coexisted seamlessly. He understood the importance of maintaining boundaries, of knowing which conversations required engagement and which required silence. This selective approach allowed him to preserve both his credibility and his personal peace. He had learned that overexposure or premature action could create vulnerabilities, while careful observation and timing allowed him to remain a trusted presence in every situation. In the quiet moments of reflection, Stephen considered the broader tapestry of his life. He recognized that his greatest strength lay not in commanding attention, but in understanding the subtle interplay of people, circumstances, and time. Every choice, every interaction, had been part of a larger pattern, and he saw now how the careful cultivation of trust, patience, and insight had shaped his path. As Boston moved around him, its streets alive with activity, its neighborhoods shifting subtly with each passing year, Stephen navigated it with the confidence of someone who understood the rhythms of life and influence. He had become a steady presence, quietly shaping outcomes, guiding decisions, and maintaining stability without drawing notice to himself. Stephen Flemmi had mastered the art of quiet authority. He understood that the most enduring influence was subtle, consistent, and deliberate. By prioritizing observation over impulse, patience over urgency, and discretion over exposure, he had positioned himself as a figure whose impact extended far beyond what was immediately visible. And as the city continued its endless motion around him, Stephen moved forward with calm assurance, ready to meet whatever came next with the same careful, measured wisdom that had defined his life for decades. Stephen Flemmi had entered a phase of life where reflection and foresight intertwined. Seamlessly, he had seen the city of Boston evolve over decades, the neighborhoods shifting, new generations rising, old faces fading, and he had learned to move through it with a quiet awareness that allowed him to anticipate change before it fully emerged. His influence was no longer exercised in dramatic gestures but in small, calculated actions, in words measured with precision, and in the careful reading of human behavior. He had become a man whom others instinctively trusted. It wasn't his power that commanded loyalty, but his consistency. People around him relied on his judgment because it was rooted in decades of careful observation and experience. He could read tension, foresee outcomes, and provide guidance without overt authority. In a world where many sought attention through force or spectacle, Stephen's strength lay in being seen as steady and reliable. Daily life was grounded in rituals that maintained clarity and focus. Mornings began with quiet reflection, assessing the day ahead, noting shifts in relationships and the city's pulse. Walks through familiar streets allowed him to see subtle changes in the environment, to notice patterns others might miss. Even small details, a new business, a change in a neighbor's routine, the tone of a passing conversation, could provide insights into larger movements. Stephen had long learned that these observations were essential for making informed choices. At the same time, Stephen maintained close, trusted relationships. Loyalty was a currency he valued above all else, and he surrounded himself with people who demonstrated consistency and discretion. He cultivated these connections not for personal gain, but to ensure stability in a life where unpredictability was constant. The network he built was quiet yet strong, a testament to years of careful attention to human behavior. Stephen also understood the power of perception. He had learned that influence often came not from direct action but from the impression he created in others' minds. A measured look, a carefully chosen word, a deliberate pause. all could communicate far more than overt displays of authority. People felt guided rather than directed, and outcomes often aligned with his intentions without anyone feeling coerced. Even as he navigated complex social dynamics, Stephen found solace in simple pleasures. A quiet dinner, a walk with a close friend, or a moment of stillness in his home provided perspective and balance. He recognized that these small moments were essential to sustaining clarity, patience, and thoughtful judgment. They reminded him that life was layered, and that human connection mattered as much as strategic awareness. Challenges still came, though they were different now than in his younger years. Miscommunications, subtle shifts in alliances, and unexpected developments tested his patience and judgment. But Stephen had learned to respond deliberately. He approached each situation with careful assessment, weighing options before acting. Impulse had no place in his life. Only reasoned, measured decisions could sustain his long-term stability and influence. Reflection had also brought him a clearer sense of legacy. He knew that influence wasn't about fame or recognition. It was about the lasting effects of careful choices, the relationships nurtured over time, and the quiet guidance that shaped outcomes without fanfare. Each day, each interaction, became a thread in the larger tapestry of his life, contributing to a story that would endure in the memory and respect of those who knew him. As the city of Boston pulsed around him, Stephen navigated it with a steady hand. He had mastered the delicate balance between engagement and observation, influence and discretion. His life was a demonstration of the power of patience, thoughtful action, and measured presence. In every conversation, every decision, and every gesture, he reflected the lessons of decades spent understanding people and circumstances. By the close of this chapter, Stephen Flemmi had become a figure defined not by dramatic acts but by the quiet authority of experience. He understood that enduring influence was subtle, consistent, and deliberate. Through patience, observation, and discretion, he had created a life of impact, resilience, and clarity. And as night fell over the city, he carried forward with the same steady confidence that had guided him for decades, ready to meet the future with measured wisdom, calm awareness, and the quiet strength of a life lived thoughtfully. This chapter of Stephen's story closed not with fanfare or spectacle, but with the quiet assurance that comes from mastery of self, mastery of observation, and mastery of the subtle currents that shape the world. His journey had taught him that true power was never loud. It was steady, deliberate, and deeply enduring. Stephen Flemmi, now moving deeper into the later chapters of his life, had refined his understanding of influence into an almost instinctive skill. He no longer needed to consciously measure every gesture or word. The years of experience had built a framework inside him, a mental map of human behavior, alliances, and city rhythms that allowed him to anticipate outcomes with uncanny accuracy. Each day became an exercise in observation, strategy, and reflection. The streets of Boston, the neighborhoods he had walked countless times, seemed to speak to him, revealing subtle shifts in the city's undercurrents that only someone with his experience could discern. The foundation of Stephen's life remained trust, patience, and discretion. Over decades, he had learned that loyalty and reliability were far more valuable than power alone. People sought his counsel not because he demanded it, but because he had proven time and again that his judgment could be relied upon, even in situations clouded by complexity or tension. His influence had become invisible in many ways, a quiet current guiding outcomes, without drawing attention to itself. In this, he had found a kind of mastery that few could achieve, shaping events without needing to dominate them overtly. Stephen's days followed a rhythm that balanced reflection, observation, and subtle action. He would rise early, often before the city fully stirred, and spend time in quiet contemplation. These moments allowed him to process developments from the previous day, anticipate potential challenges, and consider the best way to engage with both people and circumstances. He walked familiar streets, noting small but telling changes. The way a neighbor interacted with others, a new business opening, a conversation overheard in a cafe. Each of these details contributed to his growing understanding of the city and its people. By this stage, Stephen had also come to value the subtle power of presence. He realized that influence was often as much about how he was perceived as the decisions he made. A calm demeanor, a measured response, a well-timed gesture, all conveyed authority without confrontation. People responded not just to words, but to the energy he projected. Silence, when applied thoughtfully, often had more weight than any spoken argument, and Stephen had long understood the strategic value of choosing when to speak and when to remain still. The network of relationships he had cultivated over decades continued to deepen. Loyalty, once earned, required nurturing, and Stephen was meticulous in maintaining it. He surrounded himself with individuals who valued consistency, discretion, and mutual respect, and in return, he provided guidance, support, and insight. These relationships were symbiotic, built not on coercion but on trust, and they allowed him to extend his influence across situations that might otherwise have been chaotic or unpredictable. Reflection had also deepened Stephen's appreciation for the passage of time. He saw his life not as a series of isolated events, but as a long narrative, each action and decision contributing to a larger story. This perspective allowed him to measure his choices not just by immediate consequences, but by their lasting impact on people and the city itself. Legacy, he realized, was not about recognition or fame. It was about the subtle threads of influence that endured long after specific moments had passed. Even as he navigated complex social dynamics, Stephen valued simplicity and balance in his personal life. He took pleasure in quiet routines, a walk through familiar neighborhoods, a shared meal with trusted friends, a moment of reflection in his home. These routines were more than comforting. They were tools for maintaining clarity, focus, and perspective. In a life where unpredictability was constant, these anchors allowed him to approach each day with calm intention. Challenges, of course, were never absent. Shifting alliances, unexpected developments, and misunderstandings tested his judgment and patience. But Stephen had learned to respond with careful assessment, avoiding impulsive reactions that could create complications. Each challenge became an opportunity to observe, learn, and apply his accumulated knowledge. Where others might see obstacles, he saw patterns, opportunities to influence outcomes quietly and effectively. Stephen also recognized the importance of foresight. He could anticipate the actions of others not through guesswork, but through decades of careful observation and study of human behavior. He noticed the small tells, the micro-expressions, the subtle changes in tone or body language, and these clues allowed him to predict intentions and adjust his approach accordingly. This skill had become so ingrained that it felt almost instinctual, guiding his interactions seamlessly. The accumulation of experience had also given Stephen a sense of measured confidence. He no longer sought approval or validation. His actions were guided by principle, insight, and reflection. He understood that influence was most enduring when it was exercised with subtlety, when others felt empowered even as he quietly guided them. He had become a master of timing, knowing when to act, when to wait, and when to remain silent, and this awareness allowed him to navigate even complex situations with calm authority. Stephen's understanding of the city and its people was comprehensive. He had observed generations of families, watched businesses rise and fall, and noted the ways in which neighborhoods transformed over time. He understood that change was constant, but also that patterns persisted. By recognizing these patterns, he could anticipate shifts before they became obvious, allowing him to position himself and his allies advantageously without drawing attention. Even in solitude, Stephen remained vigilant and thoughtful. He spent hours considering hypothetical scenarios, reflecting on past interactions, and refining his understanding of strategy and human behavior. This mental discipline was a hallmark of his approach. Preparation and reflection were as important as any action taken in the physical world. Through this constant practice, he honed an intuitive sense of what would work, what would fail, and how to achieve influence with minimal exposure. By now, Stephen Flemmi had become a figure defined by quiet mastery. He had learned that true authority and influence did not require spectacle, aggression, or overt displays of power. Instead, they came from patience, observation, foresight, and the careful cultivation of trust. Every action, every word, every pause was deliberate, contributing to a life lived with purpose and precision. As the city moved around him, bustling with energy and change, Stephen remained a constant, an anchor of calm, insight, and deliberate influence. He had mastered the art of navigating human relationships, reading situations with clarity, and acting at precisely the right moment. The lessons of a lifetime had coalesced into an understanding of life and people that was both deep and practical, allowing him to move through complexity with quiet authority. In this stage of life, Stephen's focus was not on recognition or notoriety, but on sustaining the principles that had guided him for decades: discretion, patience, observation, and thoughtful action. He understood that these principles were enduring, capable of shaping outcomes far beyond his immediate reach. And as the city continued its ceaseless rhythm, Stephen Flemmi moved within it with the confidence of someone who had mastered not just his environment, but himself. A quiet, steady presence shaping the currents of life without ever needing to dominate them. By the end of this chapter, Stephen's life could be seen as a testament to the enduring power of measured influence. In every interaction, every observation, and every decision, he demonstrated that true mastery was subtle, deliberate, and patient. He had become a figure whose presence shaped outcomes quietly, yet profoundly, a living example of the strength that comes from knowledge, discipline, and the quiet application of wisdom over decades. Stephen Flemmi had reached a stage in life where reflection had become as important as action. Decades of observation, patience, and subtle influence had brought him to a position few could fully understand. He moved through Boston not as a man seeking control, but as someone who understood the flow of life, the nuances of human behavior, and the quiet power of presence. Every glance, every word, every silence carried meaning, and he had long learned how to use them effectively. He often walked the familiar streets of his neighborhood at dusk, observing the city's rhythm, noting subtle changes. A new cafe, children playing where decades ago the streets had been empty, conversations that hinted at shifting alliances or emerging opportunities. These small details, invisible to most, were a map to him, guiding his interactions and decisions with a clarity that only years of experience could bring. Stephen knew that influence wasn't about spectacle or force. It was about understanding the world well enough to move within it unseen yet profoundly felt. Stephen's personal life had become a sanctuary of routine and reflection. He cherished quiet mornings, leisurely breakfasts, and conversations with those he trusted. These moments weren't merely comforting, they were strategic. They allowed him to think, to observe, and to maintain a calm clarity that ensured each action he took was deliberate. Even the simplest routines became tools for preserving perspective, grounding him in the midst of a life that had always demanded careful navigation. The network of relationships he had built over decades continued to define his life. Loyalty, consistency, and trust were the pillars upon which these connections rested. Stephen nurtured them patiently, understanding that true influence relied not on coercion, but on mutual respect and reliability. Those around him knew that his guidance was thoughtful and measured, and in return, he benefited from the stability and insight they provided. It was a quiet, reciprocal power, far more durable than any outward display of authority. Stephen also recognized the subtle power of perception. He understood that people were influenced not just by actions, but by the confidence, calm, and clarity one projected. He had mastered the art of speaking little but meaning much, of remaining composed in tense moments, and of allowing others to feel that decisions were theirs while gently guiding the outcomes. In this way, he shaped the world around him without overt control, a skill few could match. The challenges that arose in later life were often different than those of youth. Misunderstandings, shifting relationships, and unforeseen developments required patience, foresight, and reflection. Stephen approached each with the same deliberate method he had cultivated over decades. Observe carefully, analyze thoroughly, and act with precision. His responses were measured, ensuring that each decision preserved both his integrity and the stability of the networks he valued. Stephen also thought often about legacy, not in terms of fame, notoriety, or recognition, but in the subtle ways his life had shaped people and events. He understood that influence was cumulative, built over years of thoughtful action and consistent behavior. Each interaction, each word, each decision contributed to a narrative that would outlast him, leaving a quiet but lasting imprint on those who had crossed his path. In quiet moments, he allowed himself to reflect on the journey he had traveled. From a young man navigating the challenges of the city to someone who had mastered observation, patience, and influence. He had learned that power was not about domination, but about understanding, foresight, and discretion. The mastery of subtle influence, the ability to shape outcomes quietly, and the cultivation of enduring trust had become his greatest achievements. As night fell over Boston, Stephen walked home, feeling a sense of calm fulfillment. The city continued its endless motion, yet he moved within it with a steady confidence, guided by decades of experience and the lessons learned along the way. He had become a figure defined not by loud displays or immediate results, but by a quiet mastery of life itself. Stephen Flemmi's story concluded not with fanfare or recognition, but with a sense of quiet accomplishment. He had lived a life of patience, observation, and deliberate action, shaping the world around him through insight, trust, and careful guidance. True influence, he understood, was subtle, enduring, and often invisible, and in that understanding lay his legacy. A life that had quietly, profoundly, and indelibly shaped the lives and events around him, leaving a mark that would endure long after the city's streets had grown still. In the end, Stephen Flemmi remained a testament to the power of measured wisdom, the strength of discretion, and the enduring impact of a life lived thoughtfully. His presence was felt not through spectacle, but through the quiet currents of influence he had cultivated, and in that, he had achieved mastery.